movements.
This confusion about how the fly-by-wire system responds in different modes is referred to, aptly, as mode confusion. And it's come up in other accidents. The plane switches into a different mode, and suddenly
pilots find it difficult to understand what's going on at that point. They do not exactly know whether the system is still taking care of the airplane or whether they are in charge now. They don't necessarily understand whether all of it has disconnected or just parts of it have disconnected.
A lot of what is happening is hidden from view from the pilots. It's buried. Or the airplane starts doing something that is unexpected, and the pilot says, "Hey, what's it doing?" That's a very, very standard comment in cockpits today. What's it up to now?
The pilots of Air France Flight 447 never quite say, "What's it doing now?" but they say similar things.
William wasn't the only person to point out that "what's it doing now" is a commonly heard question in the cockpit. It seems to be almost a running joke in the industry, a joke that everyone agrees is a serious problem.
What's the most often asked question in our cockpits? What's it doing now? Right?
That's American Airlines Captain Warren Vanderberg addressing a group of pilots in 1997. People have been talking about this issue way before the crash of Flight 447. It's just that no one's really figured out how to solve it yet.
But you see, we have become what I call children of the magenta.
The children of the magenta are too dependent on the guiding magenta-colored lines on their screens.
You know, we think we have to have those magenta lines on the map and that magenta V-bar that's steering us toward that line.
The children of the magenta are too dependent on automation in general.
And if this is you I'm talking about, do not be defensive. In the industry, we created you like this.
Vanderberg recommends, in certain situations, to turn off the autopilot and fly the plane yourself.
When you deem the situation is right, to practice your skills, turn off your autopilot and your auto throttles, fly your planes, maintain your skills.
Nadine Sarter agrees that this could help. She also recommends more and better training, using simulators to let pilots explore different kinds of emergency scenarios.
And then, of course, there are people who think the problem can be solved with more and better automation. But this is a paradox of automation.
Automation accommodates incompetence. In fact, it's designed to do that.
The Airbus was designed, after all, for Bernard Ziegler's concierge to be able to fly.
We appear to be locked into a cycle in which automation begets the erosion of skills, or the lack of skills in the first place. And this then begets more automation.
Nadine Sarter thinks it's a mistake to throw more automation at the problem.
The position I would adopt is one that has been termed human-centered automation, where we say what you need to do instead is make the automation that you have, make it maybe smarter, but importantly, make it what we call a team player. And part of that is to provide better feedback. Part of it is have the automation communicate more effectively with the pilot.
No one I talk to is advocating going back to the bad old days before automation.
So automation in general, the fly-by-wire systems, all of those certainly do increase safety, I would argue.
And even though a lot of the accidents we see these days have to do with the interaction between pilots and automation, William says you have to remember.
One of the reasons for that is that because of automation, there are hardly any other accidents.
And as far as how we should feel about Air France Flight 447 and other accidents involving automation, should they be seen as an acceptable loss in an industry that's become mostly safer through automation?
I think as a society, the answer to that is yes. For the individuals, there's no such thing as an acceptable loss, right? I mean, there's a terrible tragedy, terrible, and for the pilots who died as well.
Airbus planes are not any less safe or any more safe than any other plane on the market. Planes have accidents. But it should be said that they're pretty safe too. The accident rate for air travel is very low. About 2.8 accidents for every 1 million departures. And there are plenty of pilots out there that know how to take control in an emergency. So breathe deep, everyone. Just relax. It's going to be okay.
It's true. There are lots of good pilots out there. But in a far-off future, we might be flying in pilotless planes.
We're a long way from that, but the technology is definitely coming. And this will happen. It just makes a lot of sense. I don't think anyone is sort of loudly saying, great, that's just going to be a wonderful thing. But I think reasonable people are also not tearing their hair out about it.
Because by the time it happens, the automation will be so good and so reliable that humans, with all of our human emotions and human fallibility, the children of the magenta, will really just be in the way.
99% Invisible was produced this week by Katie Mingle with Sam Greenspan, Avery Trufelman, and me, Roman Mars. We relied heavily on the reporting and expertise of William Longaviscia for this piece, so special thanks to him. He went above and beyond for us. And if you want an even more in-depth minute-by-minute analysis of the crash of Flight 447, check out his piece in Vanity Fair. It's called The Human Factor. And on the next episode of 99% Invisible, we're going to take this idea of the automation paradox and use it as a lens to view the next great design challenge in automation, when we all potentially become the children of the magenta in our self-driving cars. It's our first two-part series, so stay tuned. Now, last week I mentioned that we have a new addition to the Radiotopia Collective, and I'm pleased to announce that Nate DeMayo's The Memory Palace is joining the gang. When I was first thinking about starting 99% Invisible, Nate was one of the first people I called because I really loved what he was doing with his show, featuring these poignant historical moments, and I wanted to do something in the same spirit with stories about design. And so, more than any other program, I can say, if you love 99% Invisible, you will love The Memory Palace. Nate and I are friends, and he once recommended a history book to me, and on page 325 I noticed a couple of sentences that were a tiny but really striking digression from the main narrative. And I'd like to think that I would have noticed the charm of this historical footnote on my own, but the real reason it stood out to me was because I knew it sparked an episode of The Memory Palace.
Most Memory Palace pieces start on page 325 of some book.
That voice you just heard is Nate DeMayo. The Memory Palace has a special way of zeroing in on these moments in history that light up your imagination and hit you in the gut or make you smile.
I had noticed that there were these historical things that would jump out from long, Ken Burns documentaries, or the one moment in some historic home tour when that object on the mantelpiece actually jumps out and says, wow, that's amazing. Look at that beautiful thing. And so often those, I noticed that the things that moved me were these focused things. They were recognizing the single object. They were, the incredible twist in someone's story. And I wanted to find out on some level if there was a way to cut to the chase, if there was a way to focus so tightly. It was almost just an aesthetic, artistic challenge. Is there a way that I can replicate this feeling of being moved, or having my, head blown off, or having my heart broken? This thing that I have once felt, is there a way that I can get people to feel that same thing? Can I retell the story in such a way that they don't have to take the whole historic home tour, or they don't have to sit through all 9.5 hours of this documentary series? Is there a way to kind of crystallize it and turn this sweeping historical story into a pop song?
But the Memory Palace is never just a simple historical anecdote. There's always something more going on.
There is a subject and then there is meaning. There are themes, which is different than plot. On some level, I'm not merely trying to, tell a historical story. I'm trying to conjure it. I'm trying to have it sort of live in the listener's mind for a bit and then melt away.
I really like his show so much that I had a hard time selecting which episode to present. So I asked Nate which episode really stood out to him as the one that did all the things he was hoping to achieve in the Memory Palace. And he picked this episode. Enjoy.
This is the Memory Palace. I'm Nate DeMayo. The world loved a World's Fair. And the Exposition Universelle in Paris in 1889 just killed. The exhibits in the grounds were unparalleled and impeccable. And at the center of it all was this audacious steel structure that managed to be imposing and elegant and the tallest thing on earth and unmistakably French all at once. Paris had the Eiffel Tower, and the men planning the next fair, the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, just a couple of years away, needed something that good. Something Eiffel Tower good. And that wasn't easy to find. The proposals ran from the ridiculous, like a structure that would soar more than 1,000 feet above the land of Lincoln, made entirely out of stacked logs, and topped with a replica of Abe's boyhood home, to the extra ridiculous, something so tall that visitors would take an elevator to the top of a slide that they'd ride down until it dropped them off in New York or San Francisco. The fair's organizers were panicking. They demanded that America's designers and engineers step up. And a man named George Ferris stepped forward. When his Ferris wheel was completed that summer, it rose 264 feet above the ground, which was a lot shorter than the Eiffel Tower. But whatever, that thing didn't even move. The idea that something so massive, but that looks so fragile, like a bicycle wheel whose spokes looked too thin to keep a bike up, was thrilling and pretty terrifying. Despite what the engineers said, despite the math and laws of physics, despite the many assurances of the fair's organizers, there were people who were sure that this ludicrous machine was going to be a disaster, that people were going to die. Not only was there no way that that flimsy thing could stand up to a prairie wind or a gale off the lake, even if it did, the prospect of tumbling through the air in a cage 20 stories above Chicago was full-on craziness. Who in their right mind was going to want to ride that thing? Hundreds of thousands of people did. Despite the fact that during its first test run, hundreds of bolts and loose parts rained down on spectators below. Despite real stories of panicked riders trying to escape through the windows when they realized exactly how high 200 feet was. Despite apocryphal stories of suicides and severed limbs, this Ferris wheel, this thing that is basically a kiddie ride today, was a bigger thrill ride than any quintuple loop open car reverse twist rocket coaster they might have at Six Flags. The papers, even some in France, said it was the marvel of the age, better than the Eiffel Tower. That almost mundane sensation we have now of looking down from above, of moving through space, up and out and down and back around. No one had ever felt those things before. And of course now we can't really feel them again. We've gone around too many times. We've looped too many loops. But back in 1893, you could pay your 50 cents and climb into a car right after sunset during the golden hour and experience something entirely new. You could rise up above the World's Fair, where down below Americans were eating hamburgers for the first time, where Buffalo Bill and Frederick Douglass and Mark Twain were sightseeing, where entire villages from Egypt and Algeria had been brought and reconstructed, where people heard ragtime for the first time, saw hula dancers and belly dancers, and you could come back to Earth and walk out and be among the first people in human history to walk around at night with lights on. But fairs end. They shut down. They pack up and leave. And the Ferris wheel did too. They moved it up to a different park in the north side of the city. And after a while, the novelty was gone. And the Ferris wheel became just a Ferris wheel. And they tore it down. A salvage company bought it for $8,000 and blew it up with dynamite and sold the pieces for scrap.
That's The Memory Palace,